Hello, I'm glad to see so many people here. My name is Leszek Górniak, I'm a technical designer. Quest design with QA approach is the topic of my presentation. And I guess I really wanted to talk about something I have never seen anyone talking about before. It's a very specific topic. I hope you'll find it as interesting as I do. First, let's state very clearly what is this presentation not about. It's not about Quest narrative. It's not about Quest flow and pacing. It's not about puzzles. It's not about combat. And basically, it's not about designing good quests. Not about designing quests that are fun, that are well-paced, that are enjoyable, no. In fact, the quest I'm going to use as an example in this presentation is a very bad quest. But it doesn't matter, because I'm going to focus solely on technical stuff, and this quest will do. And actually, this presentation is about handling quest bugs and technical issues early. It's about identifying risky quests and fragile quests, and by fragile I mean quests that are susceptible to all kinds of bugs and issues we don't want to happen. It's about designing the quests that players won't break, which is difficult, but I think we can at least make it as difficult for them as we can with all the tools in our disposal. So it's basically about technical stuff. It's about handling bugs, handling issues, and preventing players from generating any problems in our quests. Very briefly about me, because it's not the most interesting part of any presentation. I'm currently technical designer at Theon, till the end of October, actually. In November, I'm starting something else. I was the designer at Bluebird team. I was indie developer in Bob Games. I was a QA in IT industry before I joined game industry, and in fact, I'm going to rely very heavily on that experience as well, my QA experience. I was a project manager, and I did some stupid things before, like playing in bands and making stupid movies without any budget. Some games I was involved in. Two of them you may have heard of, two of them you probably have never heard of. What I'm going to talk about in detail. About the quest sequence, about quest state, about triggers, about dialogues, and about something called test scenarios. And this is the quest I'm going to use as an example quest to present the subject matter of this presentation. I called it Tools for Steve, very stupid name. It's a simple fetch quest in a post-apocalyptic open world, and it goes as follows. We're in some kind of small but open environment. We have this friend Steve who asks us to find tools because he wants to fix the car. He tells us that we can start looking in a workshop. We go to workshop, we don't find tools, but we find a note, and the note gives us additional hint on when we can actually look for the tools, and it's the storage. So we go to the storage, the lock is, we have to pick a lock, we find the tools, and we return to Steve, give him tools, and quest completed. It looks quite simple. In fact, it's not. We're going to analyze it from technical perspective. We're going to see all the things that might go wrong. And basically, that's what I mean by QA approach. QA approach means what could go wrong, what could possibly go wrong. And in this very simple quest, there are numerous things that can go wrong. So let's start with the sequence. How I understand the quest sequence is basically how the quest starts, or how is it activated, how it progresses, and how it ends. So how exactly can player complete this quest or fail this quest? To To present the quest sequence, I usually use those two types of diagrams. This one on the left is sometimes called bubble diagram, and it presents the area or the level in which the quest takes place in form of those bubbles. We see they are all connected, so player can freely move between those locations, between the central yard where Steve is waiting for his tools, where the storage is, and where the workshop is. And the diagram on the right presents the basic quest sequence. So we have a quest activation, and we have 3 objectives that we will see on our HUD in the corner as the quest progresses. So the search the workshop after we talk to Steve, then search the storage after we find the note that we have to search the storage, and talk to Steve after we find tools. We go to Steve, talk to him. Thank you very much, player. Quest completed. As a side note, for this kind of presentation, for quest representation, I use Draw.io app. It's free, and I really recommend it. It's very useful and very simple, and you can create all kinds of such diagrams in it. It's integrated with Google Docs. I really recommend this tool for this kind of graphical representation of quest logic. And now the question is, does the quest really start with a dialogue with Steve? Well, actually it doesn't. What if we omit the Steve completely and go straight to the workshop? We can find a note. What if we omit the workshop completely and go to the storage? We can find the tools after picking the lock, but there's nothing that prevents us from picking the lock. So, yep, we can find the tools, we can go back to Steve. Steve wants to give us quest, but we already have the tools. So there are at least 3 different ways of starting this quest. Progress is more or less the same, but player can skip certain stages. And when we go to talk to Steve, what Steve actually says depends on whether we found the note telling us where the tools are, on whether we already found the tools, or whether we did nothing and Steve just tells us that we have to find the tools and uses his standard dialogue. So there are quite a few possibilities here. And in my opinion, this is the greatest challenge of the open world quest design. Basically, that players can skip certain stages or try to do things in a different order than we plan as the designers. What can we do about it? In my opinion, we can do 3 things. We can take one of the 3 approaches to the quest sequence. And the first one is enforcing an immutable quest sequence. And what I mean by that? By that, I mean that we activate quest objects only when the quest is in the proper state. So in case of our quest, our tools for Steve quest, we wouldn't let player interact with the node before we have search the workshop objective activated, and we wouldn't player let interact with the tools before we have searched the storage objective activated. It's a very simple approach. It's very cheap approach. It is not exactly a very good approach because it's just not natural that we cannot interact with something and we have to be in a certain quest stage in order to interact with something. But it's simple. As I said, it's simple and cheap. It's widely used, especially in MMO games like World of Warcraft, for example. We have like things lying on the ground, we see them, and we know we will probably be asked by someone to collect those things and gather them and bring them back to the quest giver, but we cannot interact with them until the quest is active. It's the same with bosses. They are somewhere in the world, we can kill them, but it really gives us absolutely nothing. We have to go to the quest giver, activate the quest, and only then we can complete it. So this approach for MMO games of such scale, I think it's appropriate. It doesn't really bother. Well, it bothers me. I would like to kill the boss and then come to the quest giver and so that he reacts on the fact that I actually completed the quest. But I understand why they did it that way. The second approach is very similar but slightly better. It's also enforcing an immutable quest sequence, but we're using narrative and lore to justify it. So basically, it's like almost the same thing. So we let player interact with quest objects when the player is in the proper quest stage, but we use the narrative layer to justify it somehow. It requires more creativity, but facilitates immersion. In my opinion, a very nice example is Resident Evil 2. I only played Remake, and I only played this one particular part, so that's all I know about this. But Resident Evil 2 has this very linear quest sequence, but we never feel artificially blocked in any way. When the doors are closed, we know why they are closed. When something is not available, we exactly know why it's not available. The quest sequence leads us very naturally throughout the whole story. It's linear, but we're not bothered by it in any way. So, in my opinion, it's a good example of immutable quest sequence, but immutable, but very well justified by the narrative and by the story. And there is a third way. Third approach to quest sequence. It's used the tools we have at our disposal as designers, so basically quest variables that I'm going to discuss in a bit more detail in a moment, use those variables to adapt our quest to a player's choices. So basically let him do things in any order, let them do things in any order they want, and adapt. Well, it's freedom for players. For us, as designers, it's the most complex and most expensive and most dangerous and most bug-prone approach we can ever imagine. And usually those are the quests that break in games. There are numerous examples. And I even coined this very cheesy term: with a great player's power comes great designer's responsibility. So basically, this is what this third approach is about. It's about our responsibility to provide players with choices that, and with the world that react to those choices in a proper way. There are numerous examples, Assassin's Creed Odyssey being one of them. I chose it because of this funny Alexios expression. Those of you who played probably know this situation that you kill some Athenian commander, and then you find the quest giver, and this quest giver tells you that you have to kill this Athenian commander, and Alexios says something like, "Oh, you're lucky, I already killed the Athenian commander for you." Okay. Thank you. And the quest is completed. We didn't ever even know that there was any quest. So the game adapts to our choices. We can do things in a different order than intended. Usually those three approaches are mixed. We rarely see a game that has only one approach used. One might be dominating, but usually they are mixed. In our example, for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to go with the third approach, despite the fact that I think it's the worst approach for this particular quest. But we're going to go with it in order to show how many things can break. But should we decide to go with first or second approach, what could we do? We could, for example, do something like, well, in case of first approach, it's simple. Just the node is not interactable until we can interact with it, and the tools are not interactable until we can interact with them. As simple as that. Player goes to the storage, he sees the tools, it looks like non-interactable asset, prop, or whatever. If we want to go with a second approach, for example, what we could do, we could make Steve provide player with a passcode to the storage, to the workshop door. So we know that there are the order, we see that there is this keypad, we know that we probably will be able to interact after some time, and Steve is the one who provides us with the code. So we justify this sequence block with the narrative. And for example, when we find a note that tells us where the tools are, the key to the storage could be attached to this node. So the player couldn't open the door. Otherwise, of course, we would need to make the door lock unbreakable. Games do that sometimes. Some locks can be picked, some just can't be picked for the sake of the story. So this way we could use the second approach and create an immutable quest sequence, which is at least justified by narrative. But as I said, we'll go with the third approach, because this approach will I think, learn us most things. Will teach us most things. Okay. So that was quest sequence. Let's go to the quest state. This is the more complex stuff. By quest state, I mean its activation state. Examples are from Unreal Engine, but I tried to make them as universal as possible, so I think they can apply to any project. By activation state, I mean whether quest is inactive, active, completed, or failed. So this is a very crucial variable. We'll often be using this variable in order to trigger or don't trigger certain events. The second thing is the quest stage. And stage basically is, for example, in case of our quest, the stage is go to the workshop, search the storage, talk to Steve. Those are 3 stages. This quest consists of 3 stages. And there are custom variables, very, very important part. Those can be all kinds of variables, float variables, integer variables. In this case, we have, as an example, Boolean variable has quest item, which at certain point we will need. And I've already, oh, sorry. There's some kind of lag on this. I have already made a mistake here, but intentionally, what I presented is quest stage represented as an integer variable. Don't do this, ever, and I will get to that later. But there are better approaches than representing quest stage as an integer variable, unless you have a very simple linear narrative. Okay, so we're back with our quest. We have stage 0, search the workshop. We have stage 1, search the storage, and we have stage 2, talk to Steve. When we find the tools, we actually use this has quest item Boolean. We set this to true. We will need that later. And also, when we acquire the tools, we want to play certain player dialogue, like this is it, or those are the tools Steve is looking for, something like that. So in order to play it, we have to check whether the quest is active, because if it's not active, there is no point in playing that voiceover, because we don't know at that point that we are looking for those tools. So here we use actually activation stage. We check whether quest is active. If it is, we play this comment. I mentioned issues with quest stage. The first issue is very simple. The sole integer number doesn't tell us much. When we go back to our quest after a few weeks because we want to fix something or because there is a bug, we just see those integer numbers that are set somewhere with changing objective stage to 0, then to 1. Some quests have like 20 stages, and we don't know what they mean. So basically, they're not very descriptive. And the second thing is, if we need, after some time, if we decide to add a new stage between existing stages. And what if we have a condition like that? It is a very bad habit to make such conditions. In Terminator Resistance, we had lots of such conditions, and it was a real pain. We check whether the current quest. I actually used the mission here because it was my system that mission term was more proper. But I mean by mission I mean quest. So it's quest manager and current quest. We check the current stage of our current quest, and if it's the second stage, then we do something or don't do something. And if after some time we add a stage between stages, this condition breaks. So it's generally unadvisable to use this kind of condition. Much better thing to do is to use some kind of enum or a list that's actually descriptive, that tells us which objective we're actually switching to at certain point. As here, for example, we have this function to change the mission stage, but we already see what the stage is, what stages are, and so on. So it's much better approach. And a general rule for any quest condition, I would use custom variables, not stages, because stages change. Because you may add stages, you may delete stages. Custom variables are there, you can change their names, you're much more flexible with them. I know that in other engines used in bigger companies, custom engines, designers usually have this possibility to add custom variables, choose their type, like integer, float, boolean, or whatever, and use them. So I advise to use them. Don't use stages, use custom variables in order to manage your quest state. Triggers. Triggers are a second potentially problematic area of quest design. Of course, they're the cornerstone of interactive worlds. Basically, everything depends on triggers. Player goes in, something happens. Like here, when we want to, for example, spawn some enemies or something similar. In this particular quest, we use only one trigger, and we use it to play another voiceover when we approach the door that are locked, and behind those doors there are tools. So when if player found a note and approaches the door to the storage, this is it. Voiceover is played when we enter the trigger that is near this door. So we approach the door and player says something like, "This is it," or "This is the room that is mentioned in the note." But we also need to have some kind of condition here. We need to have some kind of condition here because we cannot play "This is it" voiceover when we are in a situation where player doesn't even know that when they don't know they need to find this particular room or search this particular room. Okay, so something is broken here in my presentation. For some reason, another custom variable that I wanted to show here is not displaying, because what we actually need to play this is it voiceover is another custom Boolean variable which I called player found note or something like that. So only if player found note, which is set to true after we find the note in search the storage stage, only if this player found note is true, we can play this is it voiceover, because only in this situation it makes sense. So for some reason this is not displaying. I don't know why. Perhaps it will display later, and I mixed order of my slides. I'm sorry for that. Okay. As for the triggers, there are some hints certainly that can be incorporated in your projects. The naming convention is always a tricky thing because people tend to forget about it. It's difficult to maintain it. But I really try to name my triggers, for example, after the quests they're used in. It really helps then when I'm just searching through all the assets in a scene and for all for all the assets that I use for a particular quest, when I need to search, when I need to isolate them in order to fix something, naming conventions really help. This might sound obvious, but not everyone do this. I would advise always using do once triggers, so triggers that trigger events only once. Because I think in 97.8% of situations you will need do once triggers for your quests. And of course, make sure that they save their state. What you could also do to mitigate the risk connected with triggers is use the triggers that are quest dependent. And what I mean by that is, as in this example, you can have those parameters in your triggers that represent the particular quest in which this trigger should work, or even the particular stage, but not as an integer. This is from my old project. This is wrong. But you can have triggers connected to a particular quest, and so they trigger events only in a particular quest. It is not always the most effective approach, but should be considered in certain situations. And know where your triggers are. Because, you know, as the environment is evolving, as the assets are changing their locations, as the environment teams are working and pushing the levels forward, at some point, some of triggers might not cover the required area anymore. And it's a very frequent bug that we simply forget about some of our triggers and they don't cover the required area, so player can miss them, can walk past them, never trigger certain events. Sometimes it causes minor bugs, sometimes it may even cause blockers. So it's really advisable to know where your triggers are. By the way, who gets this joke? Okay. Not as many people as I thought. You remember this scene from The Dark Knight Rises when Batman is beating Bane heavily and asking him like, "Where's the trigger?" No, okay. Okay, but know where your triggers are so that no one, like for example, the producer will not come to you at a certain point and ask you, "Where's the trigger? Do you even know where your triggers are?" Okay. Dialogues. Dialogues are very tricky and very easily breakable part of our quests, especially non-linear quests. They rely very heavily on quest state. Like in this example, for example, when we begin the dialogue, we might want to alter the contents of the dialogue, whether the quest is active or inactive or failed or whatever. So we use it extensively, and also the dialogues can alter the quest state somehow. Like, for example, when we're using dialogue options, we choose certain option like here, and if this is option number 1, then we want to activate something or change the stage or change some custom variable from true to false or change its value or whatever. So dialogues are very important, and they work both ways, like they're influenced by quest state and they alter the quest state. And in this case, actually, it gets, in case of this particular quest, it gets most complicated with dialogues. We have version 1 of the dialogue. It's the most desirable version. So we approach the Steve. We didn't do any of those things prior to approaching Steve. We approach him, and Steve asks us to find tools, and we say, "Okay, I'll look for your tools, Steve." But what if we visited a workshop before? In this case, we approached Steve after we visited workshop and found the note, and Steve asks us to find tools and tells us that we might start looking at workshop, but we need additional dialogue. Players should say, "Well, I've already searched the workshop, and I think I should look in the storage." And Steve says something like, "Okay, do whatever you find most useful in this particular situation." So we need a second dialogue for this case. We need third dialogue if we find the tools without ever approaching Steve. Then we go back to Steve and he says, "Please find the tools." And we say something like, "Ha, I already got the tools." And I really wish World of Warcraft worked this way, but it doesn't. And as I mentioned, I know why. It's just too complex for this scale and for the MMO genre in general. And there's a fourth variant of the dialogue, which is also a desirable variant. When we return to Steve, when we do the quest the proper way, we go through all the stages, and we just go back and say, "Hello, Steve, those are the tools you are looking for." Okay. And we also, what I included here, yes, is this is something, this has quest item condition check. This is why we need this boolean that I included before, because you might have wondered why I included this boolean has quest item. It seemed unnecessary, but it is actually necessary. If we don't have quest activated, we have the tools and we approach the dialogue. So on the basis of this particular variable, we play the dialogue version 3. So when we have tools and the quest is still not active. So that's why we need this particular custom variable in order to play the dialogue 3. Okay. There it is. Okay, so, well. Found you. Dobra. Sorry. Okay. Dobra. Fine. Some hints on the dialogues. Dialogues are very tricky. There aren't really many hints here. Just pay very special attention to them. Naming convention really helps. Naming your dialogue files in the same organized manner helps. Naming dialogue sequences in an organized manner really helps. And until voiceover is recorded, dialogues will change very, very, very frequently. The narrative teams change dialogues on a regular basis, and I don't blame them for that absolutely. So use flexible naming conventions, so you don't have to change the naming all over. So like, for example, in this case, it could be SQ for side quest, tools, quest activation, and we don't really care how it's activated because it has to be activated somehow, but it's quite flexible convention to use. So it can stay with us at least till late alpha, when quest is changed completely because it sucks, obviously. Okay, and the final part that I wanted to discuss today, the final thing that I think could help with maintaining quest quality are test scenarios. I think this might be the most, for most of you, this might be something actually new because the idea is taken from the IT industry. I have never seen it used in a game industry, apart from the projects that I took part in and forced everyone to do this. Test scenario is, this is a very, very boring definition. It's a statement describing the functionality of the application to be tested. And a single test scenario can cover one or more test cases. So in our case, test scenario could be a set of test cases for the particular quest. So our Tools for Steve quest can be a test scenario, and we can have multiple test cases for this particular quest. And what I mean by that, example. How to write the test case, a part of scenario for Tools for Steve. As a prerequisite, we have Tools for Steve side quest is not activated. So we want to test the case in which Tools for Steve side quest is not activated. What does player do? Players go to the storage. This is our user scenario. What is the expected result? This is it. VoiceOver is not played when player approaches the storage. Player picks a lock. Player picks up the tools. Expected result, this got it, or those might be the tools Steve is looking for. VoiceOver is not played after picking the tools because quest is still not activated. Player talks to Steve. And what we expect that dialogue version 3 is played. So Steve asks for tools and player answers that he already has them. And the second thing we expect is that the quest is activated and immediately completed during the dialogue because it was not activated and we immediately completed by returning the tools. And this is the example of the test case. And what I think, what we as designers can do is we can create a few such test cases. Absolutely, by no means should we predict all possible scenarios. It's a QA job. But what we can do is we can create a few scenarios for most vital aspects and provide QA with those scenarios. And it's a tremendous help for them. It's a really great aid because we know exactly what can break in our quests, and they have to discover it from scratch when they get them for testing. And if we provide such tools, such cases for them, it's really helpful. And in many cases, this is how in IT industry it works. So the QAs are already given test cases or test scenarios by UX designers, for example, who provide feature specifications or something like that. So in our case, what we can do is, for example, we can add such scenarios to quest documentation. For example, let's assume that for each quest we have a Jira task. And for this task, we can add test scenarios as some kind of subtasks or subtickets. And when we switch the status of our quests from in progress or like in design to for QA, QAs immediately have those test cases attached and they see what might go wrong. In our opinion, of course, they're expected to add their own test scenarios to expand this list of possibilities, what could go wrong. In the later stages, those test scenarios can serve as an acceptance criteria for the whole quest sequence. So basically, we don't need to like panic in early beta or late alpha and like, for example, when a certain feature changed and we think, whoa, There must be a software regression, something probably is broken. So what can we do? We already have our test scenarios. So we just go through them. There are acceptance criteria. We just go through them and check if everything still works as expected. As I mentioned, designers should not document every single scenario, of course. And what is very important, that in most cases, there is no point in creating such test scenarios during pre-production, because quests change. Those will immediately get outdated. So no, I absolutely do not recommend that. They should be created, for example, in Terminator Resistance, I think I created them in late alpha, somewhere like that. And this is another example from my indie game Astro Hazard solution. It represents a slightly different approach to test scenarios. In this case, used as acceptance criteria, because those are crucial elements of the game that could easily be broken, listed. And as you see, there are in color, there are comments from my QA who, I think a week or a few days before the release, it just went through them quickly and confirmed that the game is working as expected. So these acceptance criteria were prepared prior to release, and I simply asked the QA, okay, can you confirm that the game works as expected on the basis of our acceptance criteria? So this is how it could work. And this is what we can certainly, we as designers, what we can do to aid our QA team, because so they don't have to figure it out from scratch, because we already know that. And it's not really much time to prepare such documentation for quests. It's like an hour or something for us, because we know very well how our quests works and what can be easily broken by players. Okay, so a quick recap of what was discussed here. We discussed quest sequence as a first area that should be very thoroughly investigated for bugs and for potential problems. We can choose one of those three approaches. So, I mean, the quest quality and the bug prevention begins here, even before the quest is implemented. It begins when we decide on the quest sequence, because sometimes we might not need to provide this freedom for players. We can provide immutable quest sequence, which is much easier to manage. And easier to manage and enables us to maintain the quality much easier. Then we have quest state. This is something that we take care of as the quest is being implemented. We have activation state, stage, and custom variables. Generally, do not rely on stage ever. Try to rely on custom variables as much as you can. Stage is only for player information, so that you can display it on HUD so that player sees it, but it should not be used as a condition, in my opinion. In most cases, designers tend to agree with me on that. We have triggers. Triggers are tricky because they cover a certain area, and as the level changes, they might not cover this area anymore, so they need to be checked frequently. I advise naming convention for them. I advise using do once trigger as much as you can. Quest-dependent triggers sometimes, perhaps. There are dialogues. Naming convention is also advisable here. And some flexibility, because dialogues change frequently, because narrative teams change dialogues frequently, because this is how game development look like, especially in games that heavily rely on story. And there are test scenarios. This is rather experimental. It worked pretty well with Terminator Resistance. We didn't have any quest-related bugs on release. But of course, it's something new, so I understand initial anxiety or suspicions on whether it's really worth it or not. I recommend trying it. QAs will be very happy. Yes, they can be part of quest documentation. Okay, so for our quest, going back to our quest one final time, it's a simple quest, but so many things could go wrong. Dialogues could go wrong, triggers, quest state could be handled in an improper way. Quest activation is a matter here because we can do many things even before the quest is activated. So in my opinion, this quest is not worth the third freedom approach. I would go with first or second approach, or perhaps get rid of this quest completely because, as I mentioned already a few times, it's bad. And And its quality, in my opinion, does not justify the technical complexity and amount of work to be done. And it's another thing that this QA approach might tell us. It might tell us in advance that some quest might be simply not worth it because it's easily breakable and it might be as bad as this one. And as an optimistic conclusion, a quote from Scott Rogers, game designer, well, yes, unfortunately, players will always find a way to break your game, but they will break your AI, probably. They will break your physics, most probably. Lightning breaks, we know all that. Collisions, they break. But I think that in quest area, specifically in the quest area, we can actually minimize the risk of bugs happening. And it's particularly important area because if the quest goes wrong, it might block the whole progress. So, and you might also argue whether the bugs are really that important, because there were many games which had bugs. There are many games which still have many bugs, and they are still very, very, very well received. Players love them, and so on and so on. Those bugs even add some kind of, perhaps, how to call this, a certain character to those games. But in my opinion, there are two reasons why we shouldn't have bugs, and players are only one of those reasons. The second reason is our team, because you frequently were in a situation when you were playing some kind of alpha build or pre-production build, and there were many things that were broken, and maybe you reported those, maybe not, maybe we're talking about them, those bugs and issues, and responses were like, yes, we know about it, we will fix it, it's a very early stage, and so on and so on. But it's really demotivating. It gives everyone this feeling that we're working on something that is still has this prototypey feel. So in my opinion, getting rid of bugs as early as possible is as important for players as it is for you. So we can see that you are going in the right direction and you are motivated, and you see that things are the way they should be. So yes, so basically, don't let players break your quests, or at least try to make it as hard for them as possible. And it's all from me. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. Thank you. Yes.
Hello, my name is Leszek, and I'm a lead designer at 11 Bits. So you were telling about these test scenarios,
Yes.
QAs that are very helpful, and you said that designers have the best knowledge to do them quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you said that they shouldn't do the documentation. So I was wondering, thank you. So I was wondering who, where, and when should actually make those documents?
If I recall correctly, what I said was that designers should create a few such scenarios representing the most vital, easily breakable aspects of quests. So that's what I think designers should create and document, and then provide QA when the time is right with this documentation, so the QA can expand this documentation. This is my take on that.
And how do you think where is the right time? Just after creating the quest or in alpha?
I think after creating the quest, but in some situations it might be even worth it before actually creating. Sometimes even, if you prepare such scenario before creating a quest, you might discover issues you might not have been aware of before. So I might, as I hate saying it, I might say it depends, but in the usual scenario, I would say after the quest is implemented.
Right, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Maciej Leszek, programmer at Anshar Studios. During iteration, do you think it's easier to start with a very open quest and then maybe reduce the amount of interaction the player can have, or is it better to start with a very strict quest and then open it up for possible shortcuts?
I would say that the ideal approach would be to choose our type of sequence, so one of those three I mentioned, so this immutable, immutable with narrative, and freedom. I would say that in the ideal scenario, it's advisable to choose this sequence as soon as possible. But often it will not be possible. So in such case, I would say let's start with the quest. Well, I think it comes naturally. Naturally, when we create the quest, the initial state is that the player can do all things in a different order because we don't block them, because we need to implement the blockades, we need to enforce this sequence. So I think that naturally, when we create a quest, it starts as more open quest where there's more freedom, but also many potential bugs. And then we can decide whether we want to enable those choices and implement proper reactions for those choices, or whether we want to block certain possibilities and enforce this immutable sequence.
Thank you.
Hi, what do you think about automated tests for quest design, and did you try it, and what do you think about it?
I think that automated tests are something that is, of course, underused in our industry and should be used more often, but in my opinion, it should be used mostly for particular mechanics. So, like, for example, we can test whether a UI is displaying the correct data. We can test whether after an enemy is hit, if they receive proper damage. We can test whether, whether an ability works as intended, but I wouldn't recommend automating quest test scenarios. It might be not worth the time and effort. It surely is one of the most difficult aspects to automate, in my opinion, and I think that the human QA would actually do much better in this particular case.
For a situation where you have quests that may have effects on other quest lines, like completing quest A gives you additional options for quest B, what would you say would be the best practices if, like, the narrative team decides that this should actually affect what you can do here, and what would be the best practices for implementing, including that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that the approach that I mentioned, well, it's very general and flexible approach. So basically the approach that bases on quest activation state, so whether quest is active or failed or completed, and that relies heavily on variables, so booleans, integers, and so on. I think it scales beyond a single quest. So basically, if I have another quest that is dependent on, if I have quest B that's dependent on quest A, I simply refer to quest A in a quest B script, check whether the certain variable, like for example, player found quest item is true or was true in that quest, and decide on certain events that should took place in the second quest. So I think it scales. I don't think the approach is really much different for variables that are refer to more than one quest, and that the variables that refer only to a single quest. I would say that it scales, and it doesn't really matter whether it's more than one quest. Okay, so thank you again, and have a nice GIC.